Aperture.
Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. And I want to thank Aperture for, for creating this space for us to have the conversations that we've been having throughout the month of February around our relationship with mass incarceration, with punitive culture, with systems of confinement, and how we want to imagine our way out of this way of life. I also want to thank all of the participants, all of the artists and photographers who've been involved in the exhibition and the special issue, and people who are not represented here physically, but who are here image-wise, and those are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated participants who agreed to be photographed for this initiative. So my background is that in terms of how I got involved in this work, is that I started collecting images of my incarcerated relatives who were incarcerated in Ohio. And through those images, I started just thinking more and more about the cultural life of incarcerated people, and thinking about how art and visual material can serve as forms of connection and belonging between incarcerated people and their loved ones. And about 7 years ago, I started to share that work publicly, and I wasn't sure what form it was going to take, but through that initial sharing, some of these images are in the exhibition, if you haven't seen it. Through that initial sharing, people started sharing with me, and started sharing art with me, images of their time in prison, images of family members, of art that was inspired by incarceration. And so it led to a book that I just finished recently. And I just want to share with you some of the images that come from that research and that will appear in my book, hopefully that will be out next year. I do that as a way of providing context for our panel tonight, and to think about the work that's not included in this exhibition and the special issue, because most incarcerated people do not have access to photography. Aperture is an organization that's dedicated to photography, right? So thinking about how incarcerated people use other media and tools to engage aesthetic practices and to create. One of the important interventions I hope the book makes is on how we actually think about aesthetics, because the history of aesthetics, especially the Western history of aesthetics, is very much connected to ideas about freedom and mobility. So what does it mean to actually create, to produce? As I say in the book, when you're, for example, in solitary confinement, and you might be your only audience. And those are issues that I'm thinking through as I was working on the book. So with that said, I'm just going to show you a few images, and then I'll introduce our panelists for tonight. So I'm showing you an image that was in the New York Times last winter. It was part of a profile of an organization called Arts and Corrections. It's a program out of the William James Association. It's in California. It's one of the longest running organizations that provide art classes and training to incarcerated people. So it was featuring an initiative between William James Association, the California Arts Council, and Department of Corrections. And I wanted to start with this image because it's one of the most common ways that incarcerated people are engaged in art practices through formal collaborations between nonprofit organizations who are often contracted by the state, and in many ways they're in service of penal institutions to provide art classes, and that creates all kinds of tricky relationships. But I just wanted to start with that, and this is an image of a similar project. It's not a polished image from the New York Times, but it was an image that an artist gave me from one of his art classes that he teaches at Rikers. And I want to show this too because last week we talked about Rikers. This is actually a group of incarcerated people at Rikers, detainees who are painting a mural in honor of Khalif Browder. And I think many of us know about what happened to Khalif Browder when he was at Rikers. So outside of formal workshops and trainings that take place, as I said, through these collaborations with nonprofits, incarcerated people make millions and millions of artwork. Most of that work does not leave prisons, and they use all kinds of resources that they can get their hands on. So one of the most common ways of making art in prison is through textile art, using bed sheets, pillowcases, handkerchiefs, t-shirts, and turning them into canvases. And in the southwestern part of the country, there's a practice called paños, and this is an example of a paño. And paños are very much influenced by Mexican mural art. This piece right here is by an artist whose name is Manuel Maldonado, and it's part of a collection that's at the Museum of International Folk Art. Graphite drawings also are very common in prison. So if for incarcerated people who do not have access to supplies, because they do have to generally pay for supplies, many will use, for example, prison documents and a pencil and draw on the back of it. And so graphite drawings, Jesse can talk more about this as someone who's spent some time in prison. It's a very, very common way that incarcerated people engage with aesthetic practices. So now I want to talk to you about 3 ways that I actually frame the work in my book. And I frame carceral aesthetics, which is I define as art making out of the conditions of unfreedom. I frame it through three frameworks. So one is through space, through material, and around time. So I talk about penal time, penal matter, and penal space. And here's an example of an aestheticized version of penal space. This is a prison art workshop at San Quentin, and the artist is Ronnie Goodman, who actually was also involved with the William James Association. But I see this as like a prison atelier. He turns this painting not only into a self-portrait, but he's also doing curating work because he's actually reproducing his own artwork and kind of rearranging the work inside this piece. If you look in the upper corner of the painting, you will see a window, right? So you don't see the only signs of incarceration are his uniform, the barbed wire on the windows, but there's also this area where the prison guards are watching him. Here, and so again, to think about space, Ronnie Goodman was a long distance runner before he went to prison. And so he thought a lot about mobility, and he also was very interested in portraiture. And one of the things that he would do is often think about his shoes. And his shoes are symbolic, but they also are really materially important because he would run the prison yard, the same prison yard where George Jackson was killed. And he actually created the San Quentin Marathon. And the San Quentin Marathon is where incarcerated people at San Quentin run around the prison yard for 26.2 miles. He's now out of prison, and this is a photograph of him he was featured in a San Francisco local newspaper as he's a homeless man who ran last year the San Francisco Marathon. So this is an image of a profile. So to be in prison and to make art and to be an artist is to constantly think about how will one get access to material. To turn prison goods into art making is considered contraband. It's against the rules, and in some places it can land you in solitary confinement. So I spent a lot of time thinking about the kind of strategic ways that people get access to art material, and one is through relationships, creating relationships. And these relationships often cross the racial and ethnic and linguistic segregation that prison enforces. So you find a lot of really interesting multiracial art collectives that take place in prison. Here's one of my favorite pieces of prison art, and it's by Larry Machado. It's called Bone Shaker, and he spent a year and a half collecting rodent bones around the prison yard to construct his dream motorcycle. An artist I've grown close to through actually my cousins who've been incarcerated is an artist named Dean Gillespie. Dean spent 20 years in prison in Ohio. He's a white man from a very rural part of Ohio and became really good friends with my cousin Alan, who's quite urbanized and quite in every way different from Dean, but they call themselves brothers. Dean taught me about what he calls procurement, and procurement is ways of getting access to state material to create art. So here is his like dream little dinette that includes wood material that he stole from the wood shop. Or he would never say steal, he says procure. The outside of the dinette is actually the foil from inside cigarette wrappers. The rivets that hold it together are little sewing needles that people brought out for him from prison. And I'm going to show you a couple of other of his miniatures. So he's created all these, he's out now, he's created all these amazing miniatures using materials that he acquired. Here is the inside of cans, like food cans and soda cans that he's to create this dinette, the inside of the dinette. And so in terms of time, one way I think about time is thinking about people who are in solitary confinement. So there is an artist named Julie Lutalo, does not consider himself an artist at all. He's considered himself he was a political prisoner who created what he calls propaganda, very inspired by Emory Douglas of the Black Panther Party. He spent 22 years, Julie spent 22 years in solitary confinement in New Jersey. And while he was in solitary confinement, he would use his own prison papers. He'd use newspapers that covered his story to create these political collages. He'd send them out to the Prison Watch program, and the Prison Watch program would use them in their advocacy campaigns to end solitary confinement. So here are actual some of the collages that he created during his time in prison. So towards the end of the book, I think about then how does carceral aesthetics or prison art circulate in gallery spaces and in museums. And this is an example of one, and it's called Shared Dining. It's created by a group of women who were incarcerated at York Correctional Institute. They're a collective called the Women of York, and they worked here with the Elizabeth Sackler Center for Feminist Art, and it's this is called Shared Dining. It's in conversation with Judy Chicago's dinner party, and was actually shown in the room next door to it. There's also an artist named George Morton who's become a quite well-known portrait artist. He spent 10 years in prison he's just totally dedicated himself to studying portrait art. And he is now out. He was accepted to Florence Academy of Art and did a residency in Italy. And then another example is Jill Battles Hatched in Prison. It was exhibited 2 years ago at Rico Marusca Gallery, which is just a few blocks from here. And he etches on ostrich eggs, and he etches scenes from his 20 years that he spent in California state prisons. I'm happy to take questions as well as ask questions during our Q&A time. But now I'm going to introduce Joseph Rodríguez, who's a documentary photographer born and raised in Brooklyn. He studied photography in the School of Visual Arts and in the photojournalism and documentary program at the International Center for Photography in New York City. His series, Re-Entry LA, focused on documenting previously incarcerated individuals at transitional treatment centers in LA. And he has also done many works that have appeared in print and online in sources like the National Geographic, the New York Times Magazine, and the BBC. He was awarded Picture of the Year by the National Press Photographers Association and the University of Missouri in 1990, 92, 96, and 2002. He's the author of 5 books, and his photographs have been exhibited worldwide. He's represented by Gallery Bien Cachin.
Thank you very much. Before we begin, this is not art for you guys, and women and men, sorry. It's just this way of talking. I just spent 6 weeks on a story in California on re-entry in Stockton, California, so coming out of talking to maybe about 15 to 20 different lifers, what reentry is about on the street for them, the homeless issue, the methamphetamine issue, and adult reentry court, and also talking to teenagers about twisting their lives around. I've been doing this 30 years. Criminal justice is a necessity for me to document. Now, those who know my work have seen the arc. Yes, so how do we begin here in California? We began with the work of looking at gangs in the 90s, and then we went on to look at the juvenile justice project up in Northern California, and now this project Reentry is an extension of those young children and their families. All right, so I'm going to go around this gamut of pictures here. This is Alfred Cernan, who's 59 years old. I was very interested in men, particularly at first, but I also looked at women. But I was interested in sort of the addiction that you have to deal with when you come out. You give them $250 to come out on the street. It'll last maybe a day or so, and then you're right back to where it is. So we're looking at men that have been through 16 to 25 years of prison on the street. This gentleman just passed away, Frederick Ladenza, 66 years old, and I photographed him. This is a good friend of mine, Jesse de la Cruz, who did 26 years, turned his life around. You can't see his face right here, but we did a big profile on him. Was in the Northern Familia gang and big time, and so he came out and he has a doctorate in education, and he's now a gang expert. I just talked to him today. His friends, there, Ernesto and Andrew, and then Albert Yoro, who just came out and basically, you know, when I talk to these guys, what are you going to do? What do you have set up? Do you have family? A lot of them don't have family. A lot of them wind up back on the street. So here in Walden House, and I'm going to go through the pictures quite quickly because I think it's more important to talk about the work than just to show the work, and you guys can see it up on the screen. Here's Walden House, and this is where the women begin. You come in straight out of Chowchilla prison. You have to start doing the work. Do you want to turn your life around? Do you want your kids back? These are mothers who haven't seen their children in 5, 10, 15 years. And so they're doing all that work that needs to be done, not just 12-step work, but how do you deal with yourself as a mother again? Picture Angela Martinez, who was cooking up methamphetamine with her husband and was arrested and given 15 years. But she got lucky with this initiative to try to get into Walden House. Sheila and Lynette Kenny, 40 years old, 7 children. Again, same story, just trying to get her children back, trying to straighten her life out. And Shaylin, who is 22 years old, her son, Zariah, was caught in one of those situations where, yeah, come with me and just drive my car, and she didn't know it was a drive-by shooting, so they got her for manslaughter as well. Here, a young mother, I believe this is in the show, who was struggling with methamphetamine, something that is prevalent in our society today. I know everybody's talking about the opioid addiction, but methamphetamine is making people sort of mentally go off the chart in a matter of a week. All it takes you is 1 week to hit that pipe for a straight week, and you will not be the same person on the back end. So there's not just issues of her trying to get back together with her son, but it's more about how she's got to deal with this nightmare called the methamphetamine addiction. As an ex-addict, an ex-heroin addict, I mean, I know what it's like to have to go through a process of trying to kick one's habit. This was a very important scene with Walden House. They take the women down to the beach, Pacific Coast Highway, and what they do with that at this moment is to have the women sit by the ocean, many of them have never been there before, and to think about their journey, to think about their children, to think about their husbands, to think about the family they left behind. So there's lots of trauma that's sort of expressed. This is a photograph of Nolan Flash Barges, who is Master P, the very famous Master P. It's his father, although they've been estranged. We talked a little bit about prison art. I really appreciated your presentation here because I think it is very important. Where a lot of art exists in prison is on the skin of the men. And here, this is a very powerful picture about racial loyalty. This man, does anybody know what the number system means? Does anybody know what 13 means when you see that number? Anybody in the audience know what that means? That stands for M, the letter M, which stands for the Mexican Mafia. So whenever you see Su 13, now you understand what that means. Forget about what this Mara Salvatrucha stuff is all about. It's a totally different animal. What is 2-3? It's W, the letter W. So that's why those numbers appear on this man's skin. Jason Taylor, who was one of the original Crips, was running drugs and realized he could make more money by running guns. And the day that I met him, he was just out of the hospital recently, and the ATF, the FBI, and LAPD fired upon his SUV, killed his wife, killed his partner, and he became blind with bullets that were literally 40 bullets in the car. This is Chris Pepper and her roommate. A very difficult thing. If you're gay or if you're transgender and you wind up in jail or prison, it's hard enough. But I think the people who've done this work understand how challenging that can be. David Lee, a two-striker, just came out to Walden House, I'm free, but have to. Parole I think parole is the worst prison than prison itself. It is the number one. Anybody in this audience that's interested in doing criminal justice, writing about it, photographing it, filming it, go look at parole. It's the biggest nightmare. So Jose Benitez, I want you to, if you take a second, don't look at me. Look at the men in this room. Look at them. All colors, right? All races, all ethnicities. These men have done 10, 15, 20 years. Now they come home. Some of them, many of them, may not even turn it around. So he's challenging them. Where do you want to wind up? Where do you want to go? Okay. The reason why I'm looking at this work, which I think is very important in our country, not just in the state of California, is simply because the reason why people are coming out of prison, folks, it's not because we have this bleeding heart liberalism going on. It's because we cannot afford to keep them locked up. That's what it is. It's about the money. This is a photo. This family is very special. This is Darlene Escalante's family, and she came home for a Christmas visit from Walden House. She was on parole, and her mother came home from prison, and her brothers came home from prison. And just by luck, and her grandmother was there. Her grandmother passed away. She's the woman in the middle, and comes from addiction, comes from gangs. Started seeing her father when he was in prison, and her mother when she was 7 years old. But this was a beautiful moment for us to be able to show the sense of family. And those who know my work, how important that issue is for my work, family. So here's a mother coming home, and all the trauma. Oh, they were in the same prison together. So we've heard that story before. But she's crying, and look at her arms. You can see that she's been using drugs for decades, right? This is Marcos Luna. And when we talk about prison art, the story of his life is on his body, right? Because that's the only power and the only place and he spent a lot of time in Pelican Bay, and we're the only place you can actually have power and be able to honor yourself. But I've been following Marcus's story for quite some time. He works at Homeboy Industries, which is a bakery and a restaurant. My father, Greg Boyle, who did this amazing work in Boyle Heights. And so he has a job now. And his tattoos are being removed. And that's going to take him probably a good year to do because his body is completely covered. But when I just saw him recently, half his face was clean, and the other half he looked a little weird, but he was so joyful and happy. And as he would always say, if I don't straighten myself out because I'm a two-striker, it's the end of the cha-cha. So that's my work. Thank you very much.
So our second panelist is Jesse Krimes, who's a friend, and I'm also happy to say his work is in the book that it is finished. He's a conceptual artist who lives and works in Philadelphia. While serving 6-year prison sentence, he produced numerous bodies of work that have been exhibited at the Palais de Tokyo, Paris, the Zimmerli Art Museum at Rutgers University, and the Leonard Pearlstein Gallery at Drexel University, among other venues. After his release in 2014, he partnered with the Soze Agency to co-found the Right of Return USA, which is a first national fellowship dedicated to supporting formerly incarcerated artists. He is currently a 2017 Robert Rauschenberg Fellow and is represented by Burning and Water Gallery here in New York City.
Thank you, Nicole. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. And so I'm going to start by just giving some context from my work. And so shortly after I graduated from school, I was indicted by the federal government on drug charges. And so they originally caught me with 147 grams of cocaine. And when I refused to cooperate, they ended up transferring me from the prison that I was in and moving me to a solitary confinement unit. And they also used hearsay evidence, and they increased my drug weights from 147 grams up to 50 kilos, right? And so these are drugs that never existed. And that did two things. So it basically increased my sentencing guideline range from a 30-month sentence, which is what I was looking at for the original weight, to a mandatory minimum of 10 years to life. And the other thing, the reason that they sent me into solitary, again, it's one of those prosecutorial tools that they use to apply pressure to you to get you to cooperate. And so putting me in solitary for a year, this is all pre-sentence before I'm found guilty, and then also increasing my drug weights using hearsay evidence from people that I've never met, things that I could never even combat, was all a way to kind of apply pressure to me. And so all of those things were kind of really weighing heavily on me, right? Not just being in prison and being in solitary, but facing at best case scenario, I'm getting 10 years. And so, having just graduated from school and like being an artist, I didn't fully understand what that meant at the time. It was just something that I loved to do, and I just decided to go to school. But I really found out the power that it had when I was in prison. And it really solidified for me that I am an artist, that it's one of the only things that they weren't able to take away from me, right? And so artwork to me and making, it is life, it is criminal justice reform, it is everything that encompasses that, because it's one of the best ways that I know how to speak. Right? So sometimes when I speak, I'm not always as articulate, but I feel like the artwork can convey an experience and make people feel something in a way that is sometimes hard to convey through words. And so when I was in solitary, I began making image transfers out of the newspaper onto the surface of prison-issued soap. And so these are some of the works that are in the exhibition here. But at this time, one of my friends sent me Foucault's Discipline and Punish, and so I was reading Foucault and like thinking about all of these ideas of punishment and how punishment used to focus on the corporal body, but then as it transitioned and moved into our contemporary form of punishment, the way that we think of it is through this idea of redemption, of like reforming the soul and reforming the individual. But there was still like a similar thread of how they used to force people to come out into the town square and watch people be executed. And that was one of the ways that the state exerted its power, right? And so we don't do that anymore, but I began to notice that we do it in a different way, and we use media to translate this information and this power. And so these mugshots end up creating stereotypes. And so I was in there, and I was also making hundreds of these. And I needed to figure out a way to get them out. And I began collecting prison playing cards from a lot of the other guys who would play cards through the cell blocks. And so I kind of realized that the game that they were playing was very similar to what I was doing by making art. Like, it was a way to maintain my sanity, and I think that game functioned in a similar way. And so I began collecting the cards and cutting out all of the faces of the kings, jacks, and queens, and then gluing them together with toothpaste. They served as these containers that I could then send the soaps out through the mail. But again, all of this is considered contraband, it's against prison policy, so it was a whole kind of ordeal, and where I had to form relationships with the trustee, so that I could slip him my envelope, and then when he would go out to get cleaning supplies to clean the block, he would be able to drop it in the box so that the guard would never have to inspect these letters. And so these are all of the envelopes from that year in prison, from sending them out over that year-long time period. By the end of that, I had created 292 of these playing card containers and image transfers on soap. And so each one of these containers consists of 21 cards. And the way that I was able to kind of cut through these cards was taking a AAA battery, breaking it open and taking the connector from the positive to negative terminal and turning it into like a cutting device.
Because you can't have scissors.
Because you can't have scissors and you can't have an X-Acto knife. And so, you know, if you think about that, like this is really captures that sense of time, working on these 12 to 14 hours a day, and just the repetition of this and cutting through all of these cards. I think there's over 6,000 cards total of just kind of tracing this pattern and then popping the images out. And then after making these image transfers on soap, I also began transferring the images onto prison-issued bed sheets. And so kind of going back to what Nicole was talking about, it's this idea of like being forced to use the materials around you. But I was really kind of thinking about how can I use these materials to capture this experience, because I had no idea if I was going to come home or not, right? There are so many things that could happen to you while you're in prison that could lead to you getting a life sentence, or you could, other things can happen. And so I have no idea. And creating these works and smuggling them out served as a kind of surrogate body for me. But I was also thinking about the materials and these image transfers. And so transferring the heads of offenders onto the soaps and onto these religious icons, these pieces that I would draw by hand, was a way to kind of elevate these religious icons and these ideas of royalty depicted within the playing cards with that of the offender, and raising the offender to that of royalty and religious icon. Because to me, everyone's an offender. So whether you've been caught or not, everyone's broken the law, everyone's committed an offense, whether you've actually been caught or not. And so that led me to not just do depictions of offenders, but also depictions of like celebrities and politicians and other people who I'm pretty sure have done some things they shouldn't be doing. And so kind of reset then. After being in solitary, I end up going to sentencing, and we argue the drug weights at sentencing and end up winning, and I get found guilty of 500 grams of cocaine, which is significantly less than 50 kilos. And so a little bit of a disparity. And then, so I get found guilty of the 50 kilos, and for that I'm supposed to get sentenced to 100 months in prison, right? That's my sentencing guideline range. But the judge actually gave me the largest variance that court's ever handed out. And so I ended up getting 70 months in federal prison, and he recommended that I go to a low security facility as close to Lancaster, PA and my family as possible. But one of the things that didn't stand out then, that looking back on it and after being able to reflect after that, because it's such a powerful moment to be standing in front of a United States judge. But one of the things that he said to me, which I think captures the whole problem with our system, is that he said, looking at you on paper, you're an absolute train wreck. But hearing the testimony from your friends and family, it's hard for me to reconcile these two things. But I see value in you, and so I'm going to take a chance on you and give you the largest variance this court's ever handed out. And he's like, and just so you know, someone came before us just earlier today with the exact same criminal offense, the exact same criminal history, and I gave him 20 years. And so, in that moment, I didn't think of this. But after I went back to the holding cell and kind of reflected on that, I was with the other person who went before that judge because we were in the same holding cell, and that was a person of color. And so that really stands out to me and captures the bias of our system, right? Why does he get 20 years and why do I get 6? And so you know, a lot of those ideas and a lot of those things are things that I invest in the work that I don't have as much time to get into. So this is a Pakaloutine. I finally got moved to a federal facility. This is actually, I got moved to a maximum security facility, even as a nonviolent offender. And I began doing image transfers out of the New York Times onto federal prison bed sheets, and then blending the images together to create these surrealist landscapes. And so this took me 3 years to make, and it consists of 39 bed sheets and measures 15 feet tall by 40 feet long. I installed this at Eastern State Penitentiary, which is the first penitentiary in the world, and it is also the origin of solitary confinement in this country, which we still practice. The detail image. When I came home, I went back to sculpture. These are live betta fish within individual containers, all connected through pump filtration systems. But betta fish are known for being territorial, male betta fish, and so if they're kept together, they'll fight. And so this was a way to kind of put them in the system, and my work began exploring these kind of broader systems rather than these individual pieces. This is a show at Drexel, again, thinking about the system, how people move around, and kind of choreographing how people experience the work and how the work visually breaks when you look at it from different perspectives to kind of capture that nuance. Use sprint car tires from my family. I basically turned the system behind the wall inside out and exposed it, so it became this kind of immersive installation that viewers had to maneuver through. And even kind of thinking outside of that. So a lot of my work has been in galleries and museums, but I've really been getting frustrated with coming out and kind of preaching to the choir. And so I'm trying to think of ways to get my work into public space in front of people who wouldn't normally come out to an art exhibition or who isn't normally confronted with some of these issues. And so this is a project that I'm designing in support of the Close Rikers campaign. And this is basically a large-scale monument that I'm trying to find a place for in New York, which is next to impossible. So these are ceramic tiles and image transfers of abuse that happens at Rikers. This is just a sample piece. But the idea is that the tiles are painted over, and then people who have been impacted by the system can come up, cut the paint, and peel it off like skin, and it reveals this kind of underlying trauma that's been here all along, but that hasn't been revealed. It's very visceral, so I can understand why people are hesitant to put this in public space. But I also think that that's what's needed. Like, we need to make people uncomfortable. Like, it's important. And then this is a newer body of work that I'm starting to explore, making large mobiles and sourcing algorithms and pulling imagery off that kind of captures a lot of things that form social norms and identity within the public. And I'm kind of reworking them into these large pieces that will be displayed and kind of project that imagery onto the viewers as they move around. So that's it.
So our third panelist is Aliya Hana Hussain, and she is an advocacy program manager at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she manages advocacy campaigns challenging indefinite detention at the U.S. military prison in Guantanamo Bay, and the profiling and targeting of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. Her work focuses on developing new and creative partnerships with artists, musicians, and activists to bring the stories and artwork of CCR clients to new platforms and audiences. She has an essay, Storytelling Guantanamo, #Guantanamo, that was published in Obama's Guantanamo, Stories from an Enduring Prison. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I just want to quickly thank Nicole and Aperture for organizing this event tonight. I'm so pleased that the Center for Constitutional Rights could be part of this discussion, and that we can bring indefinite detention at Guantanamo Bay into the broader conversation about mass incarceration. I'm sure that when you hear Guantanamo, some of you think about those iconic images at Camp X-Ray. orange jumpsuits on brown bodies, the men's ears covered in headphones, their eyes blindfolded, their hands tied together, kneeling on the floor side by side in a cage outside. Since 2002, when the prisoners first arrived at Guantanamo, they've been depicted as the worst of the worst. We were told to believe that they deserved to be rendered, tortured, and detained at an offshore military detention facility. But when I visited Guantanamo for the first time in 2012, I saw a very different image. There were men there who were my age. They weren't ISN 178 or ISN 26. They had names, they had stories. Many of them had never been charged with a crime in the decade that they had been detained, and some of them had even been cleared for release. They talked about their family, they talked about their future, they talked about pop culture, they talked about US politics, and some of them even talked about art. On my first trip to Guantanamo, one of our clients brought artwork into the meeting. And it was the first time that I really saw how beauty and the human spirit can live in such a dark place. A government regime of secrecy and control make it really difficult to create a connection between the public, like you, and the men at Guantanamo, and in turn, empathy. But for years, the Center for Constitutional Rights and Allies have tried to bring the stories, poetry, and artwork out of the prison to offer a counter-narrative, one that humanized the people held there and through their own voice when possible. One way that we've done this is we've shared words and the experiences of clients with activists, artists, storytellers, like the people with Witness Against Torture, who are in this photo, basically to bring their story to life. Witness Against Torture created art, street performances, songs, actions, as a way to tell the story of men like Tariq Bauda, and talk about his 9-year peaceful hunger strike at Guantanamo. Tariq was essentially living in solitary confinement. And in this photograph, they're across the bay on the Cuban side of Guantanamo, standing as close as they possibly can to Tariq to show their solidarity. In 2013, my colleagues traveled to Yemen to visit Fahad Ghazi's family and to interview them, to tell his story when Fahad himself could not be on camera. That film, Waiting for Fahad, was seen by tens of thousands of people. And Fahad's own letter to viewers was translated into almost a dozen languages by Huffington Post and reached audiences throughout the world. And I wanted to mention those two examples out of many to show that we have used the stories of our clients and sort of given them to other people to help amplify them, and that has in turn created artwork that we could then bring back into the prison. We were able to show Fahad the documentary we made about his family. We were able to share photographs and the poetry that activists like Witness Against Torture created on behalf of Tariq with him. But we've also used the artwork created by men at Guantanamo to tell their story. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, art, Guantanamo, doesn't really make sense. But actually, art has existed at Guantanamo since the very beginning when the prison opened. The earliest story I've heard of art at Guantanamo is that detainees used to etch flowers and designs in styrofoam cups after meals. The guard force would then pick up the styrofoam cups and deliver them to intelligence to see if there were coded messages. Artwork was not sanctioned in any official way during the Bush years, nor was it permitted to leave the prison. Even flowers or doodles on letters to family members were blacked out before the Red Cross was able to take them. But that all changed in 2008, 2009 when President Obama came to office and a formal art class began with an instructor. Men were given watercolor paints and brushes. Many of them asked for more, and eventually were given acrylic paint and other materials. And sometimes lawyers were asked to supplement what was provided. So that looked like me going to the Blick art store around the corner from my office, not knowing anything about art, and picking out how-to books, different size paper, pastels, etc., having no idea whether or not they'd be allowed in. But taking them down on our next trip anyway. At that time, the only way art could leave Guantanamo was through the Red Cross, directly to people's families. But to be clear, All of that work was censored. Everything that leaves Guantanamo has to be US approved, literally, with a stamp on the back of every piece of artwork. CCR client Jamel and Desmond arrived at Guantanamo in 2002 and was never charged for the 11 years he was detained before returning to Algeria. He painted most of his 50-some pieces of artwork between 2009 and 2011. For Jamel, art classes were a way to pass time as he waited for his freedom, and also an emotional outlet. Making art represented a form of expression, he says, expression of feelings about the unclear future, things we were deprived of, things we dreamed of. And the beautiful thing is that instead of seeing things around you in a trivial way, it makes you see them with an artist's eye, which gives you a feeling of spiritual escape from the prison. In looking through his portfolio of work, one can see his expertise develop over time. He experimented with pastels, pens, charcoals, watercolors, and acrylics. He took art classes and eventually came to realize he was too good for them. He asked us to buy him art books for him to study on his own. When I asked Jamel what was his favorite painting, he said, the one with a boat out at sea, battered by storm, because it reflected what I was living in prison. We were always ill-treated by the guards, beaten, dragged on the floor, brutally pushed, bodily searched 3 or 4 times a day, and many other things, on a daily basis for years and years. It gave me the impression of being a boat facing storm after storm after storm that seemed never to end. So under President Obama, the art program was sort of a badge of honor at Guantanamo. The prison authorities staged prisoner art shows for visiting delegations, for the press tour. The art program was basically thought to be beneficial for everyone, including the guard force. It was a creative, intellectual outlet for detainees. They enjoyed it. It was something positive. But as I'm sure you've noticed, almost all the images I've shown you are of landscapes, still lifes, etc. And that's because any paintings made in connection to camp security or that send a political or ideological message didn't make it through the censors. So it was around 2014 that lawyers were allowed to take art out of the prison. And this was around the time Ghalib al-Bahani started painting all the time. He discovered in him the desire to paint and be creative. Ghalib was a Yemeni citizen who was imprisoned for nearly 15 years without charge before being released to Oman in January 2017. And I'll just flip through some of his images. He wrote, "Painting makes me feel as if I'm embracing the universe. I'm interested in producing paintings of nature, for it reflects the life I want to live later. A life filled with beauty, coexistence, stability, and peace of mind." During his time at Guantanamo and even after release, Ghalib has been interested in connecting with an artist community, developing his skills and hopefully finding a way to support himself. So in October 2017, Ghalib and Jamel's artwork were included in an exhibit at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. The exhibit was called Ode to the Sea, artwork from Guantanamo Bay, and it included artwork from 8 men, 5 of whom are still detained at Guantanamo today. And basically the reason that they wanted to be part of the exhibit is because they wanted people to see them as human and not as monsters. And for the men who were still detained, they wanted people to know that they were still suffering. And this wasn't the first time detainee artwork was displayed, but it got worldwide media attention, and it reached millions of people. And it's clear that people felt a connection and were starting to ask questions about the people at Guantanamo and why it was that they were held indefinitely without charge or trial for over 16 years. And the Trump administration noticed this too, and in November 2017, it banned any artwork from leaving the prison. The prison authorities declared that all artwork made at Guantanamo was the property of the U.S. government. And my colleagues have shared that art classes continue, but with very few participants. And the rules around how much art can be created and worked on at one time and disseminated have changed. And if art projects exceed the limit or individuals lose interest and turn them in, they get destroyed. So I'll end by saying that the men at Guantanamo are used to rules changing all the time, senselessly and cruelly, as a means of showing them that they're not the ones in control. But whether or not art making continues in the way it has, I have no doubt that the men will continue to try to make sure their stories are heard, and we, of course, will think creatively about how to bring that out.
So I have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask our panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So, thank each of you for your presentations. I thought they were amazing, and they all had me thinking about how the work that you are making or that you're featuring really complicate the way that we think about the idea of political art or aesthetics of politics. And I know, Aliya, you and I started talking a little bit about that earlier when you said that, for example, with Ode to the Sea, many people were talking about how this work is, this art is not political, but anything that's made in conversation with incarceration is by its definition political. So I just wanted for you all, each of you, to kind of to talk about that and talk about ways that the work that you're either doing or the work that you're representing really help us to challenge these kind of binaries.
Yeah, I'll just start off by saying, it's the thing about this, the artwork is so many reporters were asking me to ask, Jamel or Galib, what were you trying to convey in your artwork? What are you trying to convey? And they responded basically, we were just trying to make art. We weren't really trying to be political about it. But the act of them making art was political because it was essentially a way for them to live at and through Guantanamo, like another way of persevering, of resisting the system from completely taking away their individuality. And so displaying this artwork, again, in some ways, the simplest thing we can do with Guantanamo is talk about people as human beings, but it's the most radical thing you can do. The fact that the U.S. military shut down an exhibit that was just a long hallway in a university in New York City shows that it was very political. So it's just been interesting to see the conversation about the exhibit. Some people saying it's not political, some saying it's too political, and I think it's complicated.
Yeah, I think just the idea of representation itself for people who are in prison is political. It's impossible to separate, particularly for people who are directly impacted. For them to make something, it's automatically going to be invested with some kind of some kind of part of that experience of what they went through. And so, I think something that's really powerful about what you were saying is that exhibition alone, just them even making artwork that has no connotations of any political messaging that is direct, was powerful enough to move the government to shut it down. And I think that's what's necessary, is that getting the work out, getting directly impacted people in front of audiences, and allowing people to be the full capacity that they can be as human beings, which will really make people uncomfortable. And I think it will make systems uncomfortable. And I also think that's why it's the most important thing is to have directly impacted people be visible, right? And so that's something that I think is extremely important.
Me growing up in New York, as a kid, I grew up in social justice and everything from the documentaries I saw as a child of Holocaust documentaries in the 50s and 60s, from civil rights that I experienced, to our elders being killed and assassinated, to causing all this rage as a teenager, to going into the Vietnam War, to being exposed to the Black Panthers, to be exposed to the Young Lords, then studying photography and being exposed, actually going way back, being exposed as a teenager with Louis Hine and Jacob Riis, two gladiators of New York who turned their camera to look at the issues. So later on, when I studied photography much more seriously at the International Center of Photography and was studying the history, all these works all these artists made sense to Joseph Rodríguez, with all the anger that I have. Coming out of Rikers Island the second time, I used the camera to change the negative into a positive. And thank God, just like my good friend here, who uses art to get him through that darkness. it's the work's human for me first, and then it's political. I mean, when I look back at the Ark, and the reason why I get up at the age of 67 with all the other complaints that I have, and my beautiful wife is here, she can tell you how crazy I drive her every day, but I have to look back at the Ark. And the Ark is all of us who suffered to be able to get here from where we are. So the camera for me, and studying photography has always been about social documentary photography. So where's the problem? I'm going to document the problem so we can try to talk about the problem. That is the American system. Yeah, in my mind, in my photographic mind, that's the system. And it's all about redemption. That's the journey for Joseph Rodríguez and the work.
And Jesse, this is for you, but Aliya would love to hear what you have to say about this. Can you tell, especially for people who have not spent time in prison, just about kind of artistic communities in prison? And I know that having interviewed some of your friends, I know that you were making art with other people.
There's ways that art community and the people that I work with and my friends, there are ways that you're respected in a much higher manner than you are out here. And so, like, going in there and making artwork was a way of survival, but then it was also a way to kind of cross all these racial barriers in ways that wouldn't have been possible without it. And it really took like an entire community to kind of make some of the work that I was making. And those friendships, the genuine like human kindness and interaction that I experienced in there was the most powerful thing that I've ever experienced in my life. I actually haven't even experienced that since I've come home, right? And so like everyone out here kind of like performs and puts on some kind of thing, but in there, like you are who you are. And like the connections that you form with people are incredibly powerful and real, that they become family. But even outside of that, I was just stunned by the amount of creativity and just brilliance of people who are self-taught, who are so hungry to make something and speak and have a voice and be represented. And oftentimes, like, when they come home, that doesn't really happen, right? And so, I just, again, I feel like it's really important to have directly impacted people have that voice and form a community of directly impacted artists to speak about these issues. Because it's not just highlighting them, it's also highlighting them in a very nuanced way, right? Not everything about prison is negative. And sometimes some of the most powerful stories that we can tell are through those genuine acts of human kindness, right? Humanizing people instead of these like broad ideas of what it means to be an offender. But yeah, the communities are extremely powerful in there in ways that is sometimes lacking in society.
Something that I have seen play a really big part of the lives of our clients while in Guantanamo and really their survival. I'll never forget in 2013 during the mass hunger strike at Guantanamo, which had near universal participation, I sat across a number of different clients in different meetings who were weak and had lost weight and seemed like in a really dire situation, but each one of them had talked about the camaraderie with the other brothers and how in some ways they'd never felt stronger than they did in that moment because they were all banding together in protest. And, I think with art, there's no doubt there was a community with the art classes. Many of the images you'll see kind of look like they're of the same thing, and I think that's because the art instructor would give them postcards or give them things to look at, to paint. So there's a lot of similarity you see, but you also see individuality, and I'm sure there was a little bit of competition too between them about whose art was better. But the community piece is really interesting because something that I think I tried to facilitate was a sense of community that they had outside of the prison. And I mentioned this group, Witness Against Torture, who's one of our closest allies in really creating solidarity outside of the prison. And we were able to kind of take stuff out and bring stuff in a way that I think made our clients feel like there really were people out there who were part of their community and would constantly thank them, and then vice versa. I think activists who felt really inspired by the fact that their work was getting back to the men. So I think the community extended beyond just what was at Guantanamo in addition to what was there, and I think that was really important and is important for the issue and keeping people connected. Like I said, there's so many obstacles to connection, and so anything that can be done to connect human beings is important.
Thank you, first of all, for sharing your stories. I'm with the Chelsea Symphony, and we're performing at Rikers in the next couple of months. We were the first full orchestra to perform on the facility, and we're pleased to be in our second year of doing that. And we were wondering if you had any advice from your perspective and experience on how to present the best experience for our audience.
Right. Well, that's gonna shake and bake everybody. Remember Johnny Cash going to Folsom? I mean, what that did? It was amazing.
I wouldn't compare it to Johnny Cash.
No. All right, I'm old school, okay, so I'm going to reference people that I knew. But I'm saying that music, I just talked to someone, a lifer, I'm profiling now in a New York Times piece, who did 27 years. And no, his name is Henry Soul. And he played guitar, and they have a music program inside the prison system where he was. And it changed his life, and he came out now, he's writing songs. So I think music is very therapeutic. I can tell you that when I was at Rikers Island, I listened to the radio. They used to be pumped in. We used to have a soul station called WNJR, so, you know, when we listened to the music, got us through the day. So I just be who you are and just perform what you think is important.
I mean, regardless, there's going to be people in there who really connect with what you're trying to do, and people who probably would love to do something like that when they come home. And so I don't know what the opportunity is going to be between dialogue with you and the people that you're performing for, but I would really try to open something like that up and really form a connection, because doing the performance is great. It lets people know that other people on the outside care. But you can also form a conduit, right? And something that can be built upon and expanded. And, you know, maybe when they come home, they can work with you guys and build something else and then go back into it, or whatever they want to do, right? But I think opening up that dialogue rather than going in as like an external performer without interacting is important.
Thank you. So I kind of see a common through line between everyone's work, that there's art becomes this material interface that is the connection between inside and out often. And I'm wondering, what do you think gets left unspoken or not communicated within that exchange?
There's a massive archive I will never access, because when people die in prison or they leave, a lot of times their things are just incinerated. I mean, so we have created a brutal, horribly massive system where some of our most important cultural makers are not part of a broader conversation. Just thinking about the kind of the cultural impact of mass incarceration. So in some ways I feel like I say that my project is a failure. I love my project, I think, but I'll never get at what I really want to get at, and that's all that's left behind.
I think the thing that most of you don't realize is unless you've been locked up, you know, what it's like when you come home. I mean, you really are. I mean, I just left these guys in Vacaville prison who were in isolated situations, and, you know, they come together, these 12 men. I asked these 12 men, how much time do you have? The 12 of them had 246 years of time. Do you understand this? And when I said to them, that's 2.5 centuries of time. That's now. Now, they were all colors, all races. It's not about the black or brown issue so much. But what we don't understand as much is what happens when you leave the gate and you come out and when you're on parole and how delicate that situation is. You have an argument with your wife, you can get flagged. You cross the street, you get a ticket for crossing the street against the light, you get flagged. You grab a soda, you get flagged. You get a joint in your mouth, you get flagged. Now I went to a court and I saw the judge, two different judges, right? 2 different courtrooms. Same court, 2 different judges. The older judge was just violating everybody back. The second judge comes off the bench. I've never seen this in my life. It was an Oprah woman. He comes up to the offender. He hugs the offender. He says, "Listen, we can try to help you here. What's the problem?" I've never seen anything like that in court. I've been covering courts all across this country, federal, state, and local. Never seen this before. So this kind of story, I hope to God comes out in the paper as part of the story. But it's just and it's not our fault that we don't understand what happens, but, we come out and do our time and we think that that's it. It's not it. We're lucky because we have had the chances to be able to find something that gives us a voice, and this helps us with our own therapy. I mean, the trauma that we have experienced, and I haven't done as much time as you, but my dad did, and my uncles did, and all the people that I photographed in the last 25 years have, and that trauma is extremely deep, folks. It starts when they're young, and then it goes all the way up. So there are things that we don't know about prison, and about the exit of prison, which hopefully we can try to explain through the art. I mean, what I see here with Guantanamo, oh my God, So I honor what we do. It's kind of quiet work, but we are blessed to be here. Thank you for coming.
Just a point that I think Jesse and Nicole made before, it would be great to see museums who are interested in displaying this artwork thinking about a way to pay Jamel to display his artwork, or to give money to the family members of artists who are in the exhibit, to think actually how displaying this artwork and having conversations can really impact the people who are impacted in a way that's useful. So I think the sense of urgency unfortunately has been missing in this conversation, and we're just lucky that people are talking about the issue, but there are several more steps that we need to get through to get some of the artists who are in Ode to the Sea out of Guantanamo who've never been charged with a crime.
I don't think as prisons have art programs or they add them, is the intent generally to improve the lives of the prisoners, to humanize them, to give them an outlet, or is it also kind of a band-aid measure to not actually deal with the problem of like the deeper problems of incarceration of the system? Like, well, we gave them an art program, so we don't need to deal with the bigger, why these people are here in the first place in the system.
I think it depends too. Like if it's an outside program and they're coming in to work with people, most of the time it's very genuine, right? People really want to help and they want to do whatever they can, and that's important. And I think from a prison perspective, I mean, giving people something to do makes people more complacent, makes people more docile. And so it is a Band-Aid. And it's not just a Band-Aid for the prisons being overcrowded and overrun and over-incarceration, but it's like a Band-Aid over the trauma that people go through as well. There are no real services. There are no real anything that's offered in there. And so you're kind of just alone by yourself. And so, I think a lot of that trauma is part of the things that we don't talk about. That's some of the stuff that it gets invested in the work, but it's hard to communicate. But yeah, I think it is a Band-Aid. It's like a lot of the other programs. But at the same time, it's a really valuable Band-Aid, right? So I'd rather have the Band-Aid than just this open gash that's not covered at all. And so, yeah, but I think this can be like a multi-pronged thing. There should be art services, less people in prison, better access to other mental health and everything else, job, training. They offered a CDL license where I was. how the hell am I going to drive a truck? You actually have to drive the truck to get a CDL license, and so why are they teaching this while I'm in prison? It's like there are so many other things. But anyway.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. You said, sorry, Nicole, you had asked a question about prison art communities and sort of the kinds of wonderful experiences you had with other inmates. And I'm wondering, however, the ways in which an art practice within this system makes you different from prisoners who are not making art. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what kind of relationships occur with people who are engaged in this kind of practice and do consider themselves artists versus those folks who are incarcerated who engage in maybe other kinds of activities that they don't consider as art.
I don't know if he remembered telling me this. Jesse and I met, I think you had only been out for a few months when we first met. This was in 2014. And then I saw him a year later, and he had gotten quite a bit of attention. And he said, I said, how is it? He's like, it's hard because art out here is monetized. And that there's so much value of artists inside prison because there's so much that's destructive about prison. That anyone who's creating, I've heard so many artists, incarcerated artists say that people come to their cells and just watch them, or they're in a mess hall and they watch them, right? That there's just such a desire to see people making. And when you said that to me, it was really impactful that you said it's monetized out here, and this value system of art in prison is a very different thing.
I mean, I do think it has a ripple effect, right? So I taught art, established art classes while I was in, and so some people came into it with a lot of knowledge and a lot of desire to actually, build a career, right? Like they have dreams of becoming artists when they come home. And so there are people who come into it like that. And then there are people who have no art background at all, and they come into it because one, it's something to do, and two, it's also it's valued in a very different way. Where even making something like a heart on an envelope that you send to your loved ones, like the value of that is exponential, right? And so people come into this for very different reasons and from very different backgrounds. But I do think that it has a ripple effect across everyone who's in prison, and also the people who are very skilled. Like they make work, and a lot of times will give it to people. I remember making portraits for people who would be telling me something that's that's terrible, right? Like that's really affecting them outside. And so I just remember making portraits for people and giving it to them so that they could send it to their kids for their birthday, or like their brother or something because the mother is sick. And so, there are all sorts of ways that artwork has a different kind of value and how it functions within.
Thank you all so much. You mentioned, all of you things that seem to have some sort of connection, I think, about art as perseverance, or art as, one of you mentioned, reaching your full capacity as a human being. And you also mentioned artwork as being human first before it was political. And I was wondering if you could describe the way in which the practice of art involved regaining a sense of dignity.
For me, as a child, I always have this narrative in my head. When you're born below the curb, and you have lots of trauma and lots of ugly things that you see at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, the camera became a way for me to become that superhero. And I've been using it ever since. Because originally when I found photography, I just wanted to make beautiful nudes, beautiful landscapes, and that's really what I wanted to do. But in the communities that I'm connected to, it's about survival. I mean, this trauma we talk about here a little bit is beyond the capacity for us to really, really go into deep right now. It sets the tone. It set the tone for me. And my brother and sister that's up here, they have their own sort of connections to what they needed to do. It's a necessity. I was born in violence. Camera saved my life. It taught me how to resist, to reclaim, to redeem. And the most important is to redeem. Because I grew up with all the cliches, and they're still here. I turn on New York One right now. I'm going to have a hoodie running down the street in the Bronx who just killed somebody, or a baby thrown off the roof, or this or that. I mean, that's how we grow up. And by the time we get into the system, it's so laced into who we are that we have to survive in there. I mean, it's beyond the system inside. You can talk about gangs. If you don't put some tattoos on your body, folks, you die. Or you go to a separate yard now, right? Or you get raped, or you get sold. I was sold for a pack of cigarettes at the age of 17 in Rikers Island to a guy I was selling with for 36 years. I was 36 years old. Okay? I was about to jump off the tier. So I can talk about this. Why? I mean, I did my therapy, but the therapy for me has been the other people. The therapy for you has been putting those soap cans together. So we're blessed. So this is not about art. This is about humanity, and it's about survival.
I mean, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, and to kind of piggyback on that, it is trauma. There's a lot of trauma before people get into the prison system, right? And so those are a lot of the things that exist prior to someone going to prison, and then prison magnifies that. And so making artwork is a way to get dignity. It's a way to have dignity. It's a way, when you're in there, they take everything from you, everything. They move you as far away as they can possibly move you, and they just try to get you to buy into this idea that you're not worth shit. Every day, every second. And artwork, for me personally, was something that I could put all that anger and that resentment and all of those things that could have led me to do something else into something. Oh, that's my other mic. Into something positive. And yeah, I mean, like the camera, like it saved my life. I can honestly say that. And then I also think that to say it's human first and then it's political, I actually think it's political because it is human, right? I mean, we're trying to dehumanize people. Like that's what the prison system is about. And so when you try to humanize someone, being human, that is the political element of this.